Jack Reynolds wasn't a man who talked much about the past, but his eyes carried the weight of it. At 62, he had the slow, steady movements of a man who had lived through more than most could stomach. A Vietnam vet, a Bronze Star recipient, and the quiet owner of a small-town garden center in Missouri, Jack lived a humble life, until the day he was arrested for the murder of his former business partner, Earl Darby. The evidence was circumstantial, but in a town riddled with politics and whispers of land deals, someone had to take the fall. And Jack was just isolated enough, just stubborn enough, and just silent enough to be the perfect target. As his execution date neared, Jack refused interviews, rejected family visits, and declined spiritual counseling. All he asked for, his only request, was to see Sargent one last time. Sargent wasn't a person. He was a dog, a hardened, battle-trained Belgian Malinois who had once saved Jack's life overseas. After deployment, Jack adopted him, and they had been inseparable for a decade. But when Jack was arrested, Sargent was rehomed with a fellow vet named Pete Lawson down in Arizona. The prison board scoffed at the request. "We don't bring animals into a maximum security facility," they said. "It's not protocol." But Jack didn't argue. He simply muttered, "He was with me that night. He knows what happened. Maybe he's the only one who does." Meanwhile, 26-year-old Shannon Marsh, a fresh paralegal with the Missouri Public Defender's Office, was combing through evidence in a dim storage room when she stumbled upon a box labeled "Re-examined." Denied. Inside were security tapes never played at trial, footage showing Jack entering the property 40 minutes after the estimated time of death. It had been dismissed by a corrupt investigator claiming poor timestamp quality. But Shannon checked. Again. The footage was clear. It was buried, on purpose. A mistake or a cover-up? When Warden Eleanor McBride heard of Jack's renewed appeal and the mysterious footage, something in her gut twisted. She was months from retirement, but she'd buried too many men with questions hanging in the air. She had seen how the system picked its scapegoats, and Jack checked all the boxes. Isolated, tough, poor, and past his prime. She made a quiet call to the Department of Corrections and got conditional clearance to allow Sargent into the prison, if someone could bring him in time. The only problem: Sargent was in Tucson. The execution was in 72 hours, and no one wanted the job. No one except Shannon Marsh. With legal clearance in hand and the clock ticking, she hopped in her rusted Honda and made the 14-hour drive. It should have been simple, but the deeper she drove, the more problems appeared. Her tires were slashed at a rest stop outside Amarillo. Her phone was hacked. Anonymous calls warned her to turn back. Someone didn't want Sargent anywhere near that prison. And it wasn't because of allergies. She pressed on. Sargent, older, now and with a limp from his last tour, barely made the trip, but his ears perked up when he heard Jack's name. Dogs remember, especially dogs like him, trained not just for war, but for loyalty. They arrived at 6:42 a.m., less than 2 hours before the scheduled execution. Warden McBride met them herself, waving off the reporters gathering like vultures outside the prison gates. "You better be right about this," she muttered, "because if this turns out to be a circus act, they'll hang us both." Inside the sterile holding cell, Jack sat alone, still in his orange uniform, pale under the fluorescent lights. When the door opened and Sargent walked in, the room shifted. The old dog froze, stared for one eternal second, then bolted forward, tail wagging, mouth open, crying in that odd, half-howl only dogs like him could make. Jack fell to his knees. "You came," he whispered, gripping Sargent like a lifeline. The moment cracked the walls that had held Jack's emotions in check for years. But then the twist. As a staffer entered to notify Jack of the time remaining, Sargent's entire demeanor changed. He bared his teeth, snarled, lunged. The same dog who once disarmed terrorists now charged at a corrections officer named Alton Bird, the very man who had testified about finding blood evidence linking Jack to the crime. The dog hadn't seen Bird in 5 years, but he remembered and reacted. That reaction set off alarms, not in the literal sense, but in the hearts of those watching. Why would Sargent go after that man? Why only him? It cracked the case open. An emergency hearing was held. Bird's testimony was re-examined. Turns out his forensic report was missing a signature. The chain of custody was broken. More importantly, Shannon's tape showed Bird had misreported when the body was discovered. Slowly, one thread at a time, the case unraveled. Turns out Darby wasn't just Jack's business partner. He was in debt, deep debt, and someone wanted his land. A hidden trust was uncovered, owned by a city councilman's nephew. And Bird? He wasn't just a corrupt officer. He was paid off by a third party to ensure Jack went down quietly. It almost worked. Jack's execution was stayed 90 minutes before the needle. And Sargent? He was granted honorary status as a legal witness, just for the record. But the emotional cost couldn't be undone. Warden McBride resigned early, unable to shake the guilt of almost killing an innocent man. Shannon Marsh was offered a full ride to law school, her name now whispered with respect. The city councilman was indicted. Bird disappeared. And Jack? He walked out of Ironwood Federal in the same boots he wore when he was arrested, a bag of donated clothes under his arm and Sargent at his side. They drove to the Ozarks. There, with a few grants and quiet donors, Jack opened a sanctuary called the Witness Kennel, a home for retired service dogs, especially those who, like Sargent, still had more to say. But Sargent didn't have long. Months later, in a quiet moment by the river, Jack laid beside him as the old warrior slipped away. "You saved me," Jack whispered, holding the dog who once dragged him from a burning tank and later saved him from a death chamber. The story made national headlines, but Jack never liked the attention. "I just want people to know one thing," he told a reporter once. "Sometimes justice comes on 4 legs.